Not Another Anon Story, Chapter 3. Actually getting onto the train was relatively uneventful. Twilight made sure to purchase them a la carte themselves in the back of the train to make sure that whatever phenomena was going on with Anon wouldn't cause problems with any magical components on the train itself. Or at least that was her reasoning, as explained to him. Personally, he was pretty sure that it also partially might be so that he didn't freak out any of the other little ponies out too much. Not that he really minded though. Not having to share a train car with a bunch of loud-ass little pastel ponies who would probably be whispering about him the whole time sounded pretty good. They boarded and took their seats, giving each other a wide berth and sitting about 20 feet away from one another. As the train began to move, it wasn't long before Anon found himself a bit bored, deciding to bother Twilight for a bit. So, Twilight, right? You seem to have gotten what you wanted from me, so do you mind if I ask you a few questions of my own?
Huh? Oh, yeah, sure, Anon,
she said, as she sat up a bit, looking a bit perked up at the prospect of getting to teach someone. Well, I couldn't help but notice that you seem to use a lot of non-ferrous alloys and metals in your machinery. I saw what looked like a lot of brass and even a bit of aluminum. But is brass really a good choice for, stuff like this? I mean, the last I checked, brass was pretty malleable and had a low melting point, so what am I missing here? She smiled and shook her head.
You are pretty close to the answer already, really. Yes, normally brass would be an awful choice for something like building trains or railroads, but this is not regular brass. Ponies have developed a method of using specialized alchemical transformations to alter the properties of alloys like brass and bronze to make them substantially more resistant to corrosion, oxidation, and also greatly increase the amount of pressure that they can bear before deforming. Alchemical brass is actually a fairly common material used for day-to-day industrial purposes, and aluminum is generally used for constructing appliances or reducing weight in what would otherwise be fairly heavy machines, like this train.
He nodded slowly and rubbed his chin. Well, that makes sense, I suppose, but wouldn't it make more sense to use a more commonly available and naturally well-suited metal like iron, or steel, if you know how to make that? Her brow furrowed in slight confusion as she tilted her head.
I think you have that backwards. Aluminum, copper, tin, and zinc are all way more common than any sort of iron ore in Equestria. Iron is mostly found in incredibly small trace amounts in the soil, and then only in certain regions like the Everfree. And even if we had enough of it to smelt into a usable amount of metal, it would be basically useless in day-to-day construction or industry. Iron negates magic, and as I think you're able to guess by now, magic is sort of important here.
His eyes widened slightly as he felt a spark of realization. So, Twilight, how much iron does it take to affect magic?
Typically, 1/10 of a gram per cubic meter is enough to cause disruption locally. The Everfree is actually about in the ballpark for moderate magical disruption. Oh, by the way, that's the forest next to Ponyville, where Zecora lives. The concentration is low enough at the outskirts for magic to permeate the outer area of the forest, which allows certain species of mightily magical plants to still grow without being totally neutralized, which is where Zecora gets most of her potion ingredients. But the inner part of the forest is almost totally non-arcane in nature, and full of all sorts of terrifying, ungovernable flora and fauna. The weather even generally operates outside of pony control because Pegasi have a hard time getting back off the ground if they land too far into the forest.
She explained, starting to go on a tangent as he simply stared at her with mild concern. He let her prattle on a bit longer before deciding that he should probably interject. Twilight, how does your blood carry oxygen if iron in such small concentrations negate magic? He asked, seeming quite incredulous at the idea. I mean, how do you even make hemoglobin?
Don't you mean hemocyanin, Anon? Ponies don't have iron in our bloodstreams. That would just be ridiculous. Almost all animals use copper as the oxygen binding agent.
Twilight gave a soft little laugh at the thought.
Can you imagine if we actually had iron in our blood? At the required concentration to carry sufficient oxygen, a unicorn would pass out.
A horrified realization filled her eyes as she looked over at Anon again, mixed with disbelief.
Anon, are you aren't being serious, are you?
He shook his head, looking apologetic. The average human male has about 4 grams of iron in his body at any given time. It's just how our body transfers oxygen. But, Twilight, I think we may have a possible lead on why exactly my presence is so anthematic to you ponies.
Anon, I know you aren't informed about these things, so I can't blame you for being calm, but you're an actual walking arcano hazard.
she said, smacking the bottom of her hoof on the armrest of her seat.
Several of our physical bodily processes are aided and enhanced by magic, like cognitive and circulatory function,
she said, hovering a paper and pencil out of her bag, scribbling furiously again.
That actually makes perfect sense based on the symptoms that I experienced from close proximity. What with the feelings of lightheadedness, dizziness, impairment of cognition, leading to significantly enhanced feelings of paranoia and a heightened fight-or-flight response. I even ended up simply passing out once my heart rate got too high.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying that I could kill someone just by getting close to them? He asked, scooting out of his seat and sitting back down another few rows down from her, seeming quite alarmed at the prospect.
No. You should be able to be near most ponies just fine. I just have an exceptionally high level of magic in my body at any given time, because I'm a very powerful unicorn. Since my body has so much natural ambient magic, my internal systems lean on it more because it's more efficient than allowing my physical processes to take place the mundane way,
she explained gently, trying to reassure him.
The worst that you'll do to anyone who isn't a unicorn is just give them a good scare. Maybe make them feel a bit scrambled, but other races should simply feel uncomfortable and mildly confused in your immediate proximity. But creatures with natural anti-magical adaptations like dragons should be just fine. Even a normal healthy young unicorn should only become extremely cognitively impaired and panicked. The only things that you would really need to worry about are creatures that entirely require magic to sustain themselves, like timberwolves, or other ponies that have very high levels of magical power.
Her face fell slowly, and a very long string of soft "oh no's" crossed her lips as she looked over at him, then back down to her notes, then towards the large mountainside city looming over them in the distance out of the window.
Anon, we have to make sure that you do not get too close to the princesses. The results could be utterly catastrophic.
He raised his hands up defensively, waving them in front of him. Alright, I got it. No need to panic. I'm assuming that these princesses of yours are very powerful. Magically, I mean not the political kind, he said, quickly correcting himself just to make sure that she understood him correctly. She nodded and gave a small exasperated sigh, putting a hoof onto her chest as she tried to slow her breathing, clearly agitated.
Yes, the princesses are both extremely powerful. They're responsible for raising the sun and the moon, and if something were to happen to them, the results could be incredibly catastrophic,
she said, as she seemed to get a grip onto herself again. However, Anon was beginning to have his own little moments. I'm sorry, hold on. Did you just say that they move the sun and the moon? She looked over at him and raised her eyebrows slowly, nodding.
Yes, Celestia raises the sun in the mornings and lowers it at night, and Luna does the opposite for the moon. Sometimes they could even do it at the same time.
He slumped slightly at this, rubbing the bridge of his nose and grumbling softly. Oh, dear fucking Lord, Plato would have a fucking field day with you people. That motherfucker would be coming in his fucking bedsheet dress if he knew about this place.
What? Who's Plato? Is he a friend of yours?
She asked with a curious tone, the notepad and pencil coming back up as her ears perked up a bit. No, not a friend of mine. A teacher. A teacher who lived a really long time ago. He was one of the first people in my race's recorded history to meaningfully ponder the big questions about life. Some people call him the first proper philosopher, but I feel like that might be a bit much, personally.
Oh, are you a philosopher of some sort? I heard what you were reading to Applebloom when I got back, and it sounded kinda strange, but meaningful,
she said as she wrote down something in her pad, presumably about what he had just told her.
I would really like to get to know more about the way that your species thinks, both in a psychological sense and a cultural sense. And since we're gonna be here for a while, this seems like a good time, if you don't mind.
He gave her a long, unsure look, and seemed to actually think about this rather hard before giving a small resigned sigh and shrugging. Alright, but I don't think that you're gonna enjoy this very much, as a disclaimer. I'm gonna need you to fully understand that nothing I'm about to say or do is personal, and is simply my best attempt to fulfill your request. So are we clear? She nods, and smiles a bit wider over towards him, seeming quite eager, even with that disclaimer in mind.
Of course, this is all purely academic, and I'm more than capable of separating my personal feelings from the subject at hand in order to record accurate data.
Alright, very good, he said, as he leaned forward a bit in his seat. Alright, so let me start where I started, with Applebloom. What are those marks on your flanks for? The cutie marks, right? She explained it to me a bit, but I think it might make more sense if someone who's a bit more knowledgeable and mature try to explain it to me.
Those are my cutie marks, yes.
She said with a small smile, and she looked down at her own flank with a hint of pride.
When a young Coulthard filly discovers what they were meant to do, they appear on their flanks to represent their special talent. Mine is supposed to represent that I am a magical generalist, and that means that I'm talented at all forms of magic.
She explained, carefully to him. He nodded and rummaged through his bag, taking out a hardcover notebook and a pen, uncapping the latter and opening the former as he started to take some notes of his own. And I noticed that you used the phrasing, what they were meant to do. To me, that implies that your definition of what a cutie mark is involves some level of preordained fate or destiny. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, I suppose that would be, yeah. Why do you ask?
She inquired. Tilting her head slightly, she gave him a questioning look. Alright. Now, is a cutie mark something that is set in stone as soon as a pony is born, or does a pony have some amount of leeway in what they'll become talented in? Does environment and rearing have any effect on the development of a cutie mark? He asked as the pen danced across the paper in front of him.
That is a very complicated question, Inon. I'm not entirely sure how one would be able to ascertain whether or not a pony would have gotten a cutie mark for something, aside from them actually getting it.
She said, thinking about it now, and seeming a bit unsure judging by her expression. Alright. Let me ask a different question in the same vein. So, let's say a pony was to get a cutie mark in drawing. If the pony had instead decided to dedicate themselves to, say, baking, and genuinely was fulfilled by doing so, could they have instead gained a cutie mark in baking, or would they have inevitably, say, doodled on a paper one day and gotten their cutie mark from that experience, no matter how much they wanted to become a baker? She gave a vexed look to him and shook her head.
But that makes no sense. Why would they want to become a baker if they're naturally good at drawing?
He smirked softly. That question was actually helpful. Thank you, Twilight. Now, as for the why, well, perhaps baking is a family profession. Or maybe they wish to pursue baking because doing so presents incentives outside of initial satisfaction, like baking being a more sustainable profession in their town than art. Anyways, on to another question. So, is a pony satisfied by what they are allegedly destined to do, and therefore gain a cutie mark in it, or is it because, as you have stated is likely the case, cutie marks are to some extent preordained by fate? So, does the magic behind the cutie mark enforce satisfaction onto the pony it manifests onto? She almost seemed a bit offended by the question, scowling softly.
Why, of course a pony isn't forced to enjoy what their cutie mark is for. It simply always coincides with their special talent. Why would you think that they're compelled to enjoy it?
He gave a small patient sigh. Because if they're not only preordained, but also always in line with what the pony is allegedly destined to enjoy, then that means, as far as I'm able to tell, that the pony has no choice in being inclined to enjoy the task that they are essentially assigned by the marks on their flanks. As you've said yourself, why would they want to be a baker if they're naturally inclined to draw? Now, even if you don't want to think of it that way, your own thoughts on the matter betray that at some level, you do think that cutie marks are enforced rather than simply the culmination of a pony's genuine interests. According to your understanding of how these marks work, ponies are essentially bound to a certain line of work unless they want to suffer reduced satisfaction, and judging by a reaction to the concept of a pony going against their destiny, social ostracization. I can certainly imagine that a pony who doesn't have a cutie mark, whether through the inability to access the materials or circumstances that they need to learn their special talents, or from a desire to pursue a different calling, would be looked down on as a lesser by certain elements of society. She gave a grimace as she realized that he had a point. Ponies who didn't have their cutie mark often got a lot of flack from certain kinds of ponies. Ponies about who she felt that the world would be better off if they didn't act that way, but they did exist nonetheless. But still, she felt obligated to play Tyrik's advocate.
Well, such a thing is very rare. I only know of 1 or 2 ponies past adult age who don't have a cutie mark in all of Equestria. They usually get case studies done about them due to the rarity. And even so, the benefits far outweigh the potential downsides, if you could even call it that.
And there, I think, we have one of the fundamental differences in thought between equestrian culture and at least modern human culture. Perhaps postmodern was a better moniker, but he didn't want to confuse her with things that they had yet to even crack properly. Personally, I subscribe to a worldview where there is no preordained fate, and people, or in this case ponies, are free to choose their destiny as they will, shaping it entirely through their actions and, of course, involuntary exposure to events outside of their control, brought about by other people or ponies doing the same, and the natural processes of the world around us. Her face looked honestly fairly horrified at the prospect, and he noted this and continued to speak. I suppose that in the context of a world where magic exists, there may be some underlying force dictating the fate of those ensnared by it, but fortunately for myself, as far as I'm able to ascertain by my own observation, no such force held sway over me before I arrived, and I seem to be immune to the forces that would do so in this world, that I'm aware of, that didn't exist in my own. You know, come to think of it, if he was immune to the effects of magic, then how did he even get here in the first place? What sort of phenomenon would have allowed him to be transported here? They were thoughts for another time. He had other matters on his mind now. Matters such as the very anxious little unicorn now scrambling for a good answer to what he had just said.
Well, what's wrong with having a fixed destiny? That does not make the journey of experiencing it any less meaningful unless you decide that it does.
Well, that's just the thing. You don't actually get to decide if it does, or if it's preordained, or whether or not you will make that choice. The choice you think that you're making is an illusion, a fake. The outcome is already decided, and the only reason that you would, or wouldn't find the meaning in it, is due to the fact that you would have already. Without the freedom of true self-determination, any peace or harmony that might be derived from such a system is fundamentally meaningless. And it's the same way that there's no meaning in the side a coin lands on when flipped because its path was predetermined by the forces previously applied to it. Twilight appears to be getting a bit upset now, despite herself, and she frowns at him firmly as she speaks again.
That seems like an awfully cynical way to look at things, Anon, and I don't think that you're gonna make a lot of friends with that sort of attitude.
He shrugged, and gave her a cool, non-committal look. Hey, I'm just doing what you wanted me to do. You wanted to pick at my brain, right? So, it's in no way my fault that you didn't like what came out when you rummaged around. If you want, we can just drop it for now and talk about something a little less depressing for you. Seeing that he didn't mean any harm, her expression softened, and she gave a small nod, rubbing her hoof against her forehead just under her horn.
Yeah, that would be nice. Thank you.
She said, putting away her notepad and looking over at him with a small smile. Excellent, he said, clapping his hands together and smiling over at her in return. How about something a bit lighter? So tell me, how'd you get your cutie mark? I'm sure that was a very interesting story. This makes me think how ponies would fare against people like Iron Man or the Spartans from Halo. Because they're human, so they have blood in their veins, so then more on top of that would just make them more effective and more deadly. I'd imagine it's quite a frightening thing. Anyways, let's get on to our not-so-frightening donators. Top donators: TacoCat598, Peter Coulthard, J Tin Man, Darkside, Ponyman, and Gauntlet. Zar630, Strix, Rayden, Black Moonheart, Drake Lovedragon, Dospo, Delta Omega, RuneScythe9852, Hunter Norman, Dash of Evergreen, Rhynie Dragonwolf, Secret Moon, Tall Rasha, The Toilet Snake, Sword Brethren Mordred, Ronin Wandering, Random Person Man Guy, Easy, Jack Catch, Skyochia, Leslie Prickett, Jordan Peterson, Crimson Kitten A9, Lightskin, Monster Kitty, Madman Stan, Starlight Glimmer, Lightning Blitz, Squiddy Boy, David E. Sanchez, Soul Dragon, Gaggy, Trey, Shadow Drake, Joe Piercy, Alex F., Rainbow Dash, Teal'c Anderson, TV Killer, John Becker, Leon Reynolds, Raven Speedster, Zach Rakau, Mystery CU, Edgar Garcia, One Kingdom 1, Nissa Rusan, Vazuri, Dyslexic Character Sheets, Just a Random Boy, Hodrick Punkart, A Crazy Person, Ponyman365, Neapolitan, 6 of 9, Shyfire, and Stamp. Thank you all very much for watching this video, and live life to the fullest.